Slavery. What comes to mind when you hear that word? Perhaps the silhouette of African people working on cotton plantations under a blistering sun, or the anonymous figures crossing vast oceans in the dark holds of ships. But slavery isn't just that one story. Powerful as it is a universal human tragedy, a shadow that has stretched across nearly every period and every corner of our history in a multitude of forms. Today, we'll journey deep into that history to explore the different faces of this painful reality. In this journey, we'll see that slavery was not just physical bondage but also a profound economic, social, and psychological phenomena system designed to strip individuals of their agency, their identity, and their humanity. Our first stop is a civilization where slavery was not just present, but became the very engine of its existence. Ancient Rome. Think about the glory of the Roman Empire, its monumental buildings that still stand today, its disciplined armies that conquered the known world, its magnificent roads and aqueducts that carried commerce and life across continents. What was the power behind all of it? What was the fuel for this incredible machine? The answer is simple and stark: slavery. Roman society, as it was built, could not have functioned without slaves. They were the fundamental pillar of the economy. As the empire's legions expanded its borders, the number of slaves captured in wars skyrocketed, flooding into Roman markets. By some estimates, slaves made up a third of the population in ancient Italy, meaning 1 in every 3 people you saw was the property of another. Slaves in Rome were not a single, monolithic group. Their lives varied dramatically. At one end of the spectrum were the highly educated Greeks, serving as tutors, pedagogy, doctors, scribes, or artists for wealthy families. While they might have lived in material comfort, they were never free. At the other end were the untold masses who toiled in unimaginable conditions in the silver mines of Spain, where life expectancy was measured in months, or on the vast agricultural estates, the latifundia, that fed the empire. The legal status of a slave was that of a non-person. Roman law classified them as instrumentum vocala, talking tool. They could not legally marry, own property, or testify in court. A master's power over a slave was absolute, a terrifying authority known as vita nescis potestas, the power of life and death. This brutal system was not without resistance. The most famous example is the revolt led by Spartacus in 73 BC, a gladiator who escaped a training school with a small group of his fellow slaves. Spartacus ignited a rebellion that grew to include tens of thousands of runaway slaves, shepherds, and rural poor. For 2 years, this army of the dispossessed defeated several Roman legions, bringing the mighty empire to its knees and shaking its foundations. The rebellion was ultimately crushed with overwhelming force, and 6,000 of Spartacus's followers were crucified along the Appian Way as a horrific warning. Yet the story of Spartacus became a timeless symbol of the struggle for freedom. Given the vast number of slaves and the extreme cruelty of the system, why do you think major rebellions on this scale were so rare in Roman history? Now, we move to the most well-known, and perhaps the most systematically brutal, chapter of this history: the transatlantic slave trade. This was a unique system that lasted for 4 centuries and reshaped the world. It was a triangular trade route that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a deadly economic symbiosis. The system was driven by the insatiable European demand for cheap labor to work on plantations in the New World, primarily for cash crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which were becoming massively profitable. The journey for enslaved people began in Africa, where they were either captured in raids by European slave traders, or, more commonly, captured in wars and then traded by African kingdoms in exchange for European goods like firearms, textiles, and alcohol. This trade fueled a devastating cycle of violence within Africa, destabilizing societies and creating slave-raiding states. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was a living hell beyond description. Enslaved people were packed tightly into the dark, suffocating holds of ships. Chained together in unsanitary conditions where disease ran rampant, the journey could take months. And it is estimated that of the 12.5 million Africans forced onto these ships, nearly 2 million died from disease, malnutrition, suicide, and unimaginable violence. Once they arrived in the Americas, their lives were defined by chattel slavery, a system where human beings were treated as property, chattel, pure and simple. They could be bought, sold, bred, and inherited like livestock. Families were torn apart at the auction block, a deliberate act of psychological terror to break their spirits. Their identities were systematically erased, their names were replaced, their languages forbidden, their religions and cultural practices suppressed. The cruelty of this system was foundational to the economies of the Americas. The wealth of many European nations and American colonies was built directly on the backs of blood and the stolen lives of enslaved people. What do you think was the most dehumanizing aspect of this trade? The commodification of a person into a price, the physical horror of the Middle Passage, or the systematic destruction of their family and cultural identity? Next, we look at a form of slavery that was very different from the Atlantic system: slavery in the Ottoman Empire. Slavery existed in the Ottoman Empire for centuries, but it took on a different character than the race-based chattel slavery in the Americas. Slaves in the Ottoman system were not primarily used for large-scale agricultural labor. Instead, they were often valued for their service, skills, and, most importantly, their loyalty. One of the most unique institutions was the devşirme system. This was a controversial practice in which Christian boys from the Balkans were taken from their families as a form of tax, converted to Islam, and raised as slaves of the Sultan. They were not destined for a life of hard labor. However, instead, they were given the best education and military training, and many rose to become the highest-ranking officials in the palace or elite soldiers in the formidable Janissary Corps. For the Sultan, this system created a ruling class completely loyal to him, with no competing family or regional allegiances. For the boys, it was a path to power and prestige that was otherwise unimaginable. Other forms of slavery included domestic service and concubinage. Women in the Sultan's harem, while technically slaves captured in war or bought in markets, lived in a complex hierarchical world with the potential to wield significant political power. The harem was not merely a place of servitude, but a school for diplomacy and a hub of imperial power. A concubine could gain the favor of the Sultan, give birth to a son, and eventually rise to become the valid Sultan, the Queen Mother, the most powerful woman in the empire. The stories of powerful women like Hurrem Sultan and Kaksem Sultan, who went from being slave concubines to effectively corralling the empire, show that this was a system where a slave could, in theory, achieve a level of power unimaginable in other slave systems. In your opinion, does the existence of a path to power and status make this form of slavery more, or less, morally complex? Our next example shows an even more dramatic rise to power by enslaved people. The word Mamluk itself means owned or slave. Beginning in the 9th century, various Islamic rulers began to purchase or capture young non-Muslim boys, often of Turkic or Circassian origin, to train them as an elite corps of soldiers. These boys were completely loyal to their master because they were outsiders, with no other family or tribal ties in the region to divide their allegiance. The Mamluk system was based on a central contradiction. Slaves were used to protect and serve their masters, but to do so, they were given extensive military training and immense power. Over time, these slave soldiers became so powerful that they began to take power for themselves. In 13th century Egypt, the Mamluks overthrew their Ayyubid masters and established a powerful dynasty that ruled for centuries. As rulers, they successfully repelled both the Mongol invasions and the Crusader armies, demonstrating their incredible military prowess and saving the region from conquest. The Mamluk system is a fascinating and paradoxical example of how a system of slavery could create a direct path to the throne, showing that the history of slavery is far from monolithic. This brings us to a crucial final point. While we often think of slavery as a thing of the past, confined to history books, it continues to exist today. When we discuss slavery, we must acknowledge that it is not a finished chapter. Today, an estimated 50 million people worldwide are trapped in various forms of modern slavery, including human trafficking, forced labor, debt bondage, and forced marriage. These forms are often hidden from public view, operating in the shadows of the global economy. Forced labor is rampant in industries like agriculture, fishing, construction, and manufacturing, where workers are held against their will and exploited for little or no pay to produce the goods many of us consume every day. Human trafficking networks operate across borders, preying on vulnerable individuals, promising them a better life, only to trap them in servitude in the sex trade or domestic labor. Debt bondage is a vicious cycle where a person is forced to work to pay off a loan that, through exorbitant interest and manipulation, can never be fully repaid. The fight against modern slavery is a global effort that involves governments, nonprofits, and ordinary people. We cannot look at the history of slavery as a distant, solved problem. It is a continuing struggle that reminds us that the human desire for power and exploitation can take on many forms. Knowing that slavery still exists today, intertwined with the global economy, what do you think is our greatest responsibility in the fight against it? The history of slavery is a story of countless tragedies, but also of incredible human resilience. It is a story that shows us the depths of human cruelty and the heights of the struggle for freedom. By understanding its different faces, from the Roman mine to the Sultan's court, from the sugar plantation to the modern-day sweatshop, we can better understand our past, confront the injustices of the present, and work toward a more just future.